Title: The Woman Who Came Back from the Dead to Get Revenge. If you think this story is terrifying, hit subscribe, like, and comment below. You won't believe what happens next. The year was 1947. New York City, a city of towering buildings, bustling streets, and secrets buried deep in the cracks of its busy neighborhoods. But in one quiet, dilapidated corner of the city, there was a house that should have never been forgotten. The house on St. Mark's Place was the site of a chilling tragedy, one that would lead to the return of a woman who had been wronged, and whose spirit would never rest. It began on an ordinary evening with an argument that quickly turned deadly. The house belonged to William Thomas, a man whose anger and jealousy would eventually claim the life of his wife, Margaret Thomas. The police arrived the following morning, finding Margaret's body on the floor of their living room. She had been beaten and strangled in a fit of rage. William, barely able to stand, was found sitting in the corner of the room, trembling, the confession already on his lips. Margaret's death was ruled a murder, and William was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The neighbors, the police, and the entire neighborhood were certain that this would be the end of the story. But they couldn't have been more wrong. It started with whispers. Soft sounds at night. People in the neighborhood began hearing scratching noises coming from the house, sounds like nails on the wood, like something or someone trying to get out. At first, the neighbors dismissed it. Old houses creaked, right? But as the weeks passed, the strange occurrences didn't stop. One evening, a neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, walked by the house and thought she saw Margaret standing in the window, staring out into the street. She stopped, her heart pounding, convinced she must have imagined it. Margaret had been D'd for weeks. But the face she saw in the window wasn't a trick of the light. It was clear. It was Margaret's face, her pale expression haunting and unmoving. Mrs. Ramirez turned away, clutching her chest, and didn't dare to look back. The whispers soon turned into louder noises. Children walking past the house heard what sounded like someone crying inside. Others swore they heard footsteps upstairs, even though the house had been abandoned for weeks. When the police arrived, they found nothing. There was no sign of anyone living there. But the strange sounds didn't stop. In fact, they only grew louder, more frequent. One evening, a young man named David Sullivan, who had recently rented the apartment next door, decided to investigate. Armed with nothing more than his curiosity, he stood in front of the house on a cold autumn evening, peering through the cracks in the wooden fence. He heard the unmistakable sound of someone sobbing inside. The sound was so clear, so heartbreaking, that it sent chills down his spine. David waited for a few moments, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard rumors of Margaret's ghost, but he dismissed them as superstition. But now, standing there listening to the sorrowful cries coming from the house, he couldn't deny the eerie sensation that something was very wrong. The sobbing stopped. The house became still. David slowly stepped forward and creaked the front gate open. The air felt thick with tension. He reached the front porch, staring at the locked door. Then, without thinking, he tried the door handle. To his shock, it turned, the door opened slightly, as if someone had been waiting for him to come inside. David stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The house smelled of dust and old wood, but there was something else in the air, a strange coldness, like the house had been abandoned for much longer than just a few weeks. He walked into the living room, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadow dart across the floor in the corner of the room.
"Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering, but his curiosity driving him forward. There was no answer. Suddenly, a loud bang came from upstairs, followed by footsteps that seemed to echo through the house. David's heart raced as he cautiously ascended the staircase, the air growing colder with every step. He reached the top of the stairs, his flashlight trembling in his hand, casting long shadows across the hallway. And then, at the far end of the hall, he saw it. A door, slightly ajar. And inside the faintest glimmer of light, flickering like a candle. David stepped closer, each creak of the floorboards louder than the last. He reached out, pushed the door open, and froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Margaret. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She was staring directly at him, but there was something wrong. Her body was flickering, as though she didn't belong in the room. David's breath caught in his throat. The next moment, Margaret whispered, her voice low and distorted, "You shouldn't have come here." Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. David stood frozen in the middle of the room, his breath shallow, eyes locked on the flickering image of Margaret. Her ghostly form hovered in the dim light, her pale face twisted in a silent scream. The room around him was freezing, and every shadow felt like it was closing in. The walls groaned, as though the house itself was alive, suffocating him. "What do you want from me?" David's voice cracked as he tried to steady his shaking hand, the flashlight barely illuminating her form. But Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she raised her hand, pointing toward the door. "Leave now," she whispered, her voice sounding as though it were coming from far away, like an echo in a cavernous void. David's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He turned to flee, but the door wouldn't open. Panic surged through him as he twisted the doorknob again and again. It was stuck. The room felt smaller, more suffocating. He looked back at Margaret, only now she was much closer, her figure flickering between reality and a ghostly apparition. Her lips curled into a smile, one that was both horrifying and hauntingly sad. When the door finally opened on its own, David bolted out of the room, the heavy air following him as he stumbled down the hallway. He rushed down the stairs, but as he reached the front door, something stopped him in his tracks. A voice, deep and cold, echoed from behind him. "You can't leave." David spun around. No one was there. He was alone in the house, or so he thought. Suddenly, the floor beneath him groaned. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the room, blocking his exit. It was William Thomas, the man who had murdered his wife, Margaret. But he was no longer the man he once was. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and rotting, as though he had been dead for years. David's pulse quickened as he backed toward the door. William didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze alone told David everything he had returned as part of Margaret's curse, bound to her spirit. The air grew colder, and the oppressive force in the house tightened around him. Margaret's voice whispered from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside his own head. David stumbled backward, but William stepped forward, his hand extended as if to grab him. Just as David turned to make his escape, he heard a loud crash from upstairs. Something heavy had fallen. The sound was so violent it rattled the house. The lights flickered again, and the house seemed to groan in agony, as if it were protesting against the curse it had been subjected to. David didn't wait to find out what happened next. He bolted for the front door, his heart racing as he shoved against it with all his strength. It opened. He stumbled outside into the cold night air, his breaths coming out in ragged gasps. But when he looked back at the house, something made his blood run cold. The window of room 103 was wide open. A faint light flickered inside, casting an eerie glow on the front yard. And in the window, Margaret's face appeared once again, staring directly at him. This time, there was no flickering, no distortion. Her eyes were filled with rage, filled with pain. "You can never escape," she whispered, her voice chilling him to the bone. The days that followed were a blur of terror. David couldn't stop thinking about the house. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Every night he heard footsteps in his own apartment, as if someone was walking just behind him. At night, when he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face, pale and distorted, hovering just above his bed. He began seeing shadows lurking in the corners of every room. Unable to bear it any longer, David sought out a paranormal investigator, hoping to find answers. The investigator, Carlos. Cruz listened carefully to David's story before agreeing to visit the house. But Carlos, a seasoned expert in hauntings, warned David that the curse of Margaret and William Thomas wasn't something that could be easily broken. He explained that the house was built on land soaked with tragedy, and that spirits of the wronged often sought vengeance from those who had wronged them, trapped in a cycle of rage and sorrow. That evening, Carlos, armed with holy artifacts, entered the house with David. The air inside was thick, the temperature dropping instantly as they stepped inside. It felt as though the house was alive, the walls breathing with the whispers of long-dead souls. They made their way to room 103, where everything had begun. As soon as Carlos stepped inside, he stopped. The air was so dense it felt like a physical weight. He glanced around the room, his eyes wide in disbelief. In the far corner, the shadow of Margaret appeared once again. But this time, her form wasn't flickering. It was solid as any living person. And as the shadow stretched toward them, Margaret's voice rang through the room. "I'm not finished yet. The curse won't end until I have my revenge." But as Carlos began to chant the prayers to break the curse, something shifted. The floorboards creaked, the lights flickered violently, and Margaret's voice screamed louder. The air in room 103 was suffocating. The temperature had dropped so low that David's breath fogged in front of him, and the walls seemed to breathe in and out, as though the house itself were alive. The low hum of Margaret's voice filled the room, whispering things David couldn't quite hear but felt deep in his bones. Carlos, the paranormal investigator, stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the spot where Margaret's ghostly figure loomed in the corner of the room. She wasn't the flickering image he'd seen earlier this time. She was solid, her figure unmistakably real, standing tall in a flowing torn dress, her face pale and twisted in pain. David's heart pounded. He had heard the stories, he had seen the ghost, but now that it was real, he couldn't breathe. The very essence of terror had gripped him, and the room felt as if it was closing in. "I'm sorry," Carlos muttered under his breath, clutching the crucifix in his hand. "This isn't going to be easy." Margaret's screeching laughter filled the air, a noise so high-pitched it seemed to rattle the very foundation of the house. "You think you can rid me?" she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "I've been here for decades. No one escapes me. No one." The floor beneath their feet began to tremble and the walls seemed to groan. David reached out to Carlos, his grip desperate. "What do we do? She's not leaving. We're trapped." Carlos closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. "We need to banish her spirit," he said, his voice resolute. "But it's not just about the ritual. It's about understanding the source of her pain. We have to confront it, her pain and her anger." But before Carlos could complete the ritual, something unexpected happened. The floor beneath them cracked open. It was as if the house itself were fighting back. A dark mist started to seep from the cracks in the walls, swirling around their feet and rising higher. The mist was thick and suffocating, and in the middle of it, David saw a figure emerging from the darkness. It was William Thomas, Margaret's murderer, his face contorted with rage. His eyes were vacant, hollow like a man long dead. His hands were stretched toward David and Carlos, and the anger in his face was palpable. "You think you can save yourselves?" William's voice rumbled, deeper and more sinister than ever before. "Margaret will never leave this place, and neither will you." The walls seemed to close in around them. The air grew even colder, and the very light in the room flickered as if it were alive, fighting to stay on. David's mind raced. He thought of everything he had heard about the house, about the curse, about how Margaret's spirit could never rest because of the grief and rage from her untimely death. But now, it wasn't just Margaret who was trapped here. It was both her and her killer, bound in an eternal loop of vengeance. As the room grew darker, with shadows flickering violently, Carlos stepped forward, holding the crucifix high. "We need to separate them," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "We have to bring closure to both of their spirits." David nodded, the realization dawning on him. This wasn't just about Margaret getting revenge. It was about freeing them both, Margaret from her pain and William from the eternal punishment of his own guilt. The ritual Carlos had been preparing was the only way to put an end to this nightmare. But before they could act, the temperature dropped even further. A freezing gust of air blew through the room and the walls shook violently. Suddenly the lights went out completely and they were left in total darkness. In the silence, they heard it. The sound of water dripping, slow and rhythmic. And then in the darkness, Margaret's voice, soft but chilling, spoke directly into David's ear. "You can't escape me." David's heart pounded in his chest. "Carlos, where are you?" His voice shook, his eyes darting around in the pitch-black room. But there was no reply. It was as if Carlos had vanished. Then, the floor beneath David's feet shifted. He stumbled, grabbing for something to hold on to. As he did, the room lit up again. But now Margaret's figure was right in front of him, her face twisted in agony. Suddenly, she lunged forward, and the air around David grew colder still. The very walls of the room seemed to suffocate him. He could hardly breathe as the oppressive presence of Margaret's vengeful spirit surrounded him. Her hand reached out, gripping his throat with an icy coldness. He gasped, feeling her fingers tighten. But then, a blinding flash of light filled the room. David staggered back, his breath ragged as the light grew stronger. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The temperature returned to normal. The darkness lifted. The house fell silent. In the middle of the room stood Carlos, holding a golden pendant in his hand, glowing softly with light. The crucifix had worked. The curse had been broken. David, gasping for breath, looked around the room. The air was heavy, but the presence of Margaret and William was gone. There was no more scratching in the walls, no more whispers. The house felt empty, abandoned, and, for the first time in weeks, peaceful. But as David left the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. Something unseen. Something waiting. When he got home and turned on his phone, he found a new message in his inbox. It was from an unknown number. "I'm still here. You can't run from me. You can never run." And then, David realized something. The curse wasn't over. Not yet. If you thought this was terrifying, the next story will haunt you even more. Hit subscribe button so you don't miss it.